Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. The American soldier in World War II. From civilian to combat. When the United States entered World War II, it did so with an army that was unprepared for the scale and brutality of modern global warfare. In 1941, the U.S. Army ranked far behind the major powers of Europe in size and experience. Most American soldiers were not professionals. They were civilians pulled from factories, farms, offices, and schools, suddenly thrust into a conflict that spanned continents and oceans. The transformation from civilian to combat soldier would define the American wartime experience. After Pearl Harbor, mobilization happened at breathtaking speed. Millions of men were drafted or volunteered within months. Training camps sprang up across the country, turning quiet towns into centers of military life. Young men arrived with little understanding of what awaited them. Training was intense but often rushed. Drill instructors focused on discipline, physical endurance, and basic combat skills, knowing that many of these men would soon face experienced enemy forces. American soldiers trained with a mix of outdated equipment and newly produced weapons. Early shortages forced improvisation. Uniforms were standardized, but quality varied. Weapons training emphasized rifles, machine guns, grenades, and basic tactics. Yet many soldiers would later say that nothing truly prepared them for real combat. War, they learned, could not be simulated fully on a training field. Deployment overseas was often a shock. Soldiers crossed oceans in crowded troop ships, unsure of where they were going or what awaited them. Some landed in Britain, preparing for combat in Europe. Others were sent to North Africa, Italy, or the Pacific. For many, this was their first time leaving home, their first time seeing another country, and their first time confronting the reality that death was now a constant possibility. Combat shattered expectations quickly. American soldiers discovered that the battlefield was chaotic, confusing, and terrifying. Orders could be unclear or outdated. Communications failed. Plans collapsed under enemy fire. Fear was universal, regardless of rank or experience. Veterans later recalled that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. Living conditions were harsh. Soldiers endured extreme cold in Europe and suffocating heat in the Pacific. They slept in foxholes, ruins, jungles, or makeshift shelters. Food was often cold or insufficient. Hygiene was poor. Disease, exhaustion, and stress weakened entire units. Letters from home became lifelines, connecting soldiers to a world that felt increasingly distant. Despite these hardships, American soldiers adapted. Small unit leadership proved critical. Sergeants and junior officers often determined whether men survived. Camaraderie became essential. Soldiers relied on each other for survival, comfort, and sanity. Bonds formed in combat were stronger than anything many had known before. World War II forced ordinary Americans into extraordinary roles. The citizen soldier became the backbone of the U.S. military effort. These men would fight in deserts, forests, cities, and islands against enemies who were often better trained and more experienced early in the war. Through trial, loss, and adaptation. They learned how to fight and survive. This was only the beginning. The American soldiers' journey through World War II would be marked by brutal battles, moral challenges, and lasting consequences. The war would shape not only how these men fought, but who they became long after the fighting ended. Life at the front. Fear, fatigue, and survival in combat. For the American soldier, arrival at the front line marked the true beginning of the war. Training, drills, and preparation quickly faded as combat imposed its own reality. The front was not a clear line on a map. It was a shifting, dangerous space where safety could vanish without warning. Whether in Europe or the Pacific, American soldiers learned that survival depended as much on awareness and discipline as on weapons. Fear was constant. Artillery fire could arrive without warning, tearing through positions and leaving no time to react. Mortar rounds fell suddenly, forcing soldiers to dive for cover. Small arms fire snapped through the air, often from unseen enemies. Veterans later said that fear never disappeared. Instead, they learned to function while afraid. Those who could not adapt risked freezing under fire, endangering themselves and others. Fatigue became one of the greatest enemies. Combat operations often lasted for days or weeks without rest. Soldiers slept in short bursts, if at all. In Europe, rain and cold soaked uniforms and boots, leading to trench foot and illness. In the Pacific, heat and humidity drained strength, while insects and disease weakened entire units. The body slowly broke down under constant stress, hunger, and lack of sleep. Daily life at the front was primitive. Soldiers lived in foxholes, ruined buildings, or shallow trenches scraped into the ground. Clean water was scarce. Washing was rare. Clothing became stiff with mud, sweat, or blood. Rations were monotonous and often eaten cold. Hot meals were rare and deeply valued. Medical care existed, but evacuation under fire was difficult, and many wounded waited hours before reaching aid. Combat was unpredictable. Long periods of boredom could suddenly erupt into intense violence. Patrols moved cautiously through forests, villages, or jungle, never knowing when contact would occur. Mines and booby traps were constant threats. A single misstep could kill or maim. In the Pacific, Japanese forces frequently infiltrated American positions at night, attacking suddenly and disappearing into darkness. In Europe, German units used ambushes and snipers to wear down advancing troops. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment. Watching friends wounded or killed was deeply traumatic. Many soldiers blamed themselves for surviving when others did not. There was little time to grieve. Combat demanded immediate focus. Emotions were suppressed simply to function. Leadership at the front mattered enormously. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers often made life or death decisions. Clear orders, calm behavior, and personal courage could stabilize units under fire. Poor leadership, confusion, or hesitation could lead to disaster. Soldiers quickly learned whom they could trust. Camaraderie became a survival tool. Men depended on each other not only in battle but emotionally. Shared hardship created bonds stronger than family for many. Humor, even dark humor, helped relieve tension. Small routines, such as cleaning weapons or sharing cigarettes, provided a sense of normalcy in chaos. Despite the fear and exhaustion, American soldiers continued to fight. They adapted, learned, and endured. Life at the front stripped away illusions and forced men to confront their limits. Survival required resilience. Combat in Europe: forests, cities, and close range. Fighting for American soldiers in Europe, combat quickly proved to be far different from anything imagined during training. Unlike open battlefields shown in manuals, the war was fought in dense forests, ruined cities, narrow streets, and small villages that turned every advance into a deadly gamble. German forces were experienced, disciplined, and skilled at defensive warfare. Every environment favored the defender, and American troops had to learn how to fight in close quarters under constant threat. One of the most difficult environments was the forest. In places like the Hürtgen Forest, American soldiers fought for weeks in cold, wet, and heavily wooded terrain. Visibility was limited to a few yards. Artillery shells exploded in treetops, sending lethal fragments raining down. Movement was slow and exhausting. Units became disoriented, communications failed, and evacuating wounded soldiers was extremely difficult. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters, often at the cost of dozens of lives. Urban combat was equally brutal. As American forces pushed into towns and cities, fighting became a room-by-room struggle. German troops used rubble, basements, and upper floors to create layered defenses. Snipers waited in hidden positions, while machine guns covered streets and intersections. A single building could change hands multiple times in one day. Soldiers cleared rooms with grenades and rifle fire, knowing that hesitation could be fatal. German defenses relied heavily on discipline and coordination. Units conducted effective delaying actions, withdrawing only after inflicting maximum casualties. Anti-tank weapons were positioned to ambush American armor at close range. Mines and booby traps were widespread, slowing advances and creating constant fear. Even after areas were secured, danger remained. Explosives were hidden in buildings, roads, and abandoned equipment. American soldiers adapted through hard experience. Combined arms tactics became essential. Infantry worked closely with tanks, artillery, and engineers. Tanks provided firepower, but depended on infantry for protection against enemy soldiers hiding at close range. Engineers cleared mines, destroyed obstacles, and built bridges under fire. Artillery support was critical, often called in at close distances to break German strongpoints. Leadership at the small unit level proved decisive. Squad leaders and platoon commanders often made independent decisions in chaotic situations. When communications broke down, initiative mattered more than orders from higher headquarters. Soldiers learned to read terrain, anticipate ambushes, and move cautiously. Experience, not rank, often determined survival. Weather compounded the hardship. Rain turned roads into mud. Cold sapped strength and morale. In winter, frostbite and exposure became serious threats. Soldiers fought in soaked uniforms, sleeping in foxholes or ruined buildings. Despite these conditions, operations continued. There was little relief from the front. Civilians added another layer of complexity. In liberated areas, American soldiers encountered populations that were hungry, displaced, and traumatized. In combat zones, civilians were often caught between opposing forces. Soldiers had to balance compassion with caution, knowing that enemy forces sometimes used civilian areas for cover. Combat in Europe demanded constant vigilance and endurance. There were no clear victories at the tactical level, only survival and gradual progress. Each village captured, each forest cleared, pushed American forces closer to Germany, but always at a cost. These battles hardened American soldiers, turning inexperienced troops into veterans capable of sustained combat in the Pacific, jungle warfare, and an enemy that refused to surrender. For American soldiers and Marines, combat in the Pacific was a completely different experience from the war in Europe. The enemy, the terrain, and the conditions created a form of warfare that tested endurance to its limits. Dense jungles, volcanic islands, extreme heat, and constant humidity turned every operation into a struggle for survival. The Pacific War was not about sweeping advances across continents. It was about brutal, close-range fighting on isolated islands where retreat was often impossible. Jungle terrain dominated much of the fighting. Visibility was limited to a few meters. Thick vegetation hid enemy positions and made movement slow and exhausting. Patrols advanced cautiously, never knowing when contact would occur. Japanese forces used the jungle expertly, building concealed bunkers, trenches, and firing positions that were nearly invisible until they opened fire. Ambushes were frequent. A single shot could erupt into sudden chaos. Unlike in Europe, surrender was rare. Japanese military doctrine emphasized fighting to the death. Many American soldiers quickly learned that battles did not end when ground was captured. Enemy troops often remained hidden in caves, tunnels, or vegetation, launching surprise attacks days or even weeks later. Clearing an area meant constant vigilance, repeated sweeps, and close combat at point-blank range. The environment itself was an enemy. Heat drained strength and focus. Humidity soaked uniforms and equipment. Boots rotted, weapons rusted, and infections spread easily. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and fungal diseases weakened entire units. Medical evacuation was difficult, and many soldiers were hospitalized for illness rather than wounds. Sleep was scarce. Insects, noise, and the constant threat of attack made rest nearly impossible. Night combat was especially terrifying. Japanese forces frequently attacked after dark, infiltrating American positions silently. Soldiers learned to sleep lightly, weapons always within reach. Flares, tripwires, and defensive fire became routine. Confusion at night led to friendly fire incidents, adding to the stress. Veterans later described the nights as worse than the days, filled with tension and fear. Combat tactics evolved rapidly. Flamethrowers, grenades, and demolitions became essential for clearing bunkers and caves. Artillery and naval gunfire were used extensively, but enemy positions were often deep enough to survive bombardment. Infantry had to finish the job up close. Casualties were heavy, and psychological strain was constant. Many soldiers described the Pacific War as relentless, with no sense of safety even after objectives were secured. Logistics were critical. Supplying troops on remote islands required enormous effort. Food, ammunition, water, and medical supplies had to be delivered across long distances under threat of enemy attack. Delays meant hunger, thirst, and vulnerability. Despite these challenges, American logistical systems improved steadily, providing a crucial advantage over time. The Pacific battlefield stripped combat down to its most basic elements. There were no front lines, only danger in every direction. Victory came not from rapid movement, but from persistence and overwhelming force. American soldiers learned to adapt, endure, and continue forward despite fear, exhaustion, and loss. The Pacific War demanded a different kind of strength. It hardened those who fought there in ways that stayed with them long after the war ended. These experiences shaped how American forces approached combat and reinforced the understanding that modern war could be fought in environments where nature itself was as leadership, brotherhood, and survival under fire. In World War II, survival for the American soldier depended on far more than weapons or strategy. It depended on leadership, trust, and the bonds formed between men under constant threat. While generals planned campaigns and divisions moved across maps, the reality of war was lived at the level of squads and platoons. Here, leadership was immediate and personal, and its impact could mean the difference between life and death. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers carried enormous responsibility. Lieutenants, sergeants, and corporals were often only a few years older than the men they led, yet they were expected to make decisions under fire, with incomplete information and extreme pressure. When communications failed, which happened frequently, these leaders had to act on instinct and experience. A calm voice, clear orders, or personal courage could steady men in moments of chaos. Poor leadership, hesitation, or confusion could result in disaster. Combat quickly erased social differences. Rank mattered, but competence mattered more. Soldiers judged their leaders not by insignia, but by whether they shared danger, understood the terrain, and cared about their men. Leaders who exposed themselves to the same risks earned loyalty. Those who stayed behind, cover lost respect. Veterans later recalled that trust in leadership was one of the most important factors in maintaining morale. Brotherhood became a powerful force. Soldiers depended on each other for protection, emotional support, and survival. Men learned each other's habits, fears, and strengths. They watched each other's backs in combat and shared what little comfort they could find. Cigarettes, food, jokes, and letters from home were shared freely. These small acts created a sense of normalcy in an environment defined by violence. Loss was constant. Friends were wounded or killed without warning. Units took casualties that could never be replaced. New soldiers arrived, inexperienced and frightened, and had to be integrated quickly. Veterans often took responsibility for training newcomers, knowing that their survival depended on learning fast. Grief was rarely processed openly. There was no time. Soldiers moved forward because stopping meant death. Leadership also meant discipline. Maintaining order under fire prevented panic. Units that held formation, followed procedures, and trusted commands were more likely to survive. This discipline was not rigid obedience, but a shared understanding of how to act when chaos erupted. Training reinforced habits that could function even when fear overwhelmed conscious thought. Mental strain accumulated over time. Prolonged exposure to combat led to exhaustion and psychological breakdown. What would later be recognized as combat stress affected thousands of soldiers. Some froze under fire, others became withdrawn or reckless. Commanders faced difficult choices, balancing the need to keep units fighting with the reality that men could only endure so much. Rotations, rest periods, and medical intervention were limited, but crucial. Despite everything, cohesion held many units together. Soldiers fought not for abstract goals, but for the men beside them. This sense of responsibility often outweighed fear. Veterans later said they continued forward because they could not abandon their comrades. Brotherhood became a shield against despair. World War II revealed that wars are not won by equipment alone. They are won by people under extreme pressure, guided by leadership, wounds, trauma, and the cost. Paid. After the battle for the American soldier, the cost of World War II did not end when the fighting stopped for the day. Wounds were not only physical, The war inflicted lasting psychological and emotional damage that many soldiers carried long after leaving the battlefield. In a conflict defined by constant danger, prolonged exposure to violence took a heavy toll on those who fought. Physical injuries were common and often severe. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, and blast trauma filled field hospitals and evacuation centers. Medical care improved rapidly during the war, saving countless lives that would have been lost in earlier conflicts. Blood transfusions, antibiotics such as penicillin, and advanced surgical techniques reduced mortality rates. Yet survival often meant living with permanent disabilities. Amputations, chronic pain, and disfigurement became part of daily life for many veterans. Evacuation from the front was often chaotic. Wounded soldiers were treated by medics under fire, carried to aid stations, and moved through a chain of medical facilities. Delays were common, especially in difficult terrain or under heavy enemy pressure. Many died before reaching proper care. Medics faced extreme risk, often exposing themselves to enemy fire to reach wounded men. Their work saved lives, but came at a high, personal cost. Psychological trauma was less visible, but equally damaging. Constant fear, loss of comrades, and the stress of combat pushed many soldiers beyond their limits. What is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder was then referred to as combat fatigue or battle exhaustion. Symptoms included anxiety, nightmares, emotional numbness, and inability to function under stress. Some soldiers broke down completely, unable to continue fighting. Attitudes toward psychological injury were mixed. In the early years of the war, mental collapse was often misunderstood or stigmatized. Soldiers were sometimes accused of weakness or cowardice. Over time, military leadership recognized that prolonged combat could overwhelm even the strongest individuals. Treatment centers were established near the front to provide rest, counseling, and recovery. Quick treatment allowed many soldiers to return to duty, but others were permanently removed from combat. Returning to civilian life presented new challenges. Veterans struggled to adjust to a world that seemed distant and unreal after years of war. Loud noises triggered memories. Sleep was disrupted by nightmares. Some found it difficult to connect with family members who could not understand their experiences. The transition from constant danger to normal life was often harder than expected. Despite these struggles, many veterans rarely spoke about what they endured. Silence became a common response. Society celebrated victory, but the emotional cost of the war remained largely hidden. Only decades later would the psychological impact of World War II receive broader recognition and understanding. The wounds of war shaped an entire generation. They influenced how veterans approached life, work, and relationships. The experience of trauma also changed how future wars would be understood and treated. World War II forced militaries and societies to confront the reality that survival does not always mean healing. For the American soldier, the war did not truly end on the battlefield. It continued in memory, in injury, and in the long process of rebuilding a life after conflict. The cost paid after the battle was one that could not be measured in statistics alone. Coming home, victory, adjustment, and a changed America. For millions of American soldiers, the end of World War II did not immediately bring peace. Victory meant survival, but returning home was not a simple transition. After years spent in combat zones, crossing oceans and continents, many veterans found that adapting to civilian life was one of the hardest challenges they faced. The war had changed them, and it had also changed the country they were returning to. Demobilization began on a massive scale. Millions of servicemen were transported back to the United States in waves. Troop ships that once carried soldiers into war now carried them home. Some returned quickly, while others waited months or even years, still stationed overseas as occupation forces. The process was slow and often frustrating. Soldiers who had survived intense combat struggled with uncertainty and impatience as they waited for discharge. When veterans finally arrived home, they were often welcomed as heroes. Parades, celebrations, and public gratitude marked their return. Families reunited after years of separation. Yet beneath the celebrations, many veterans felt disconnected. The routines and concerns of civilian life seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions of combat. Friends and relatives wanted stories, but few could truly understand what the soldiers had endured. The transition to civilian work was uneven. Some veterans quickly found employment, especially as the post-war economy expanded. Others struggled to adjust to structured jobs after years of unpredictable danger. Skills learned in combat did not always translate easily to civilian careers. Psychological stress, unrecognized trauma, and physical injuries made adjustment harder for many. One of the most significant responses to these challenges was the GI Bill, officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This program provided returning veterans with access to education, job training, low-interest home loans, and unemployment benefits. Millions of veterans used these opportunities to attend college, buy homes, and start businesses. The GI Bill reshaped American society, expanding the middle class and fueling economic growth for decades. Despite these opportunities, not all veterans benefited equally. Some faced discrimination or lacked access to resources. Others carried invisible wounds that education or employment could not heal. Combat stress, nightmares, and emotional withdrawal continued long after the war ended. Many veterans coped in silence, believing their struggles were personal weaknesses rather than lasting effects of war. The presence of millions of veterans also transformed American culture. Shared wartime experiences created a sense of collective identity. Veterans influenced politics, labor, education, and community life. Their expectations shaped post-war priorities, including housing, infrastructure, and social stability. The war generation became a defining force in American public life. At the same time, the memory of the war loomed large. Veterans remembered fallen friends, destroyed cities, and moments of fear that never fully faded. What the American soldiers' experience in World War II still means today. World War II ended decades ago, but the experience of the American soldier continues to shape how war, service, and sacrifice are understood today. The men who fought in that conflict were not professional warriors by design. They were citizens who answered a call during a moment of global crisis. Their journey from ordinary life into the most destructive war in history became a defining chapter not only for them, but for the nation itself. The American soldier's experience revealed the true nature of modern warfare. It showed that war is not a sequence of heroic moments, but a long process of endurance, fear, loss, and adaptation. Training prepared men to fight, but it was combat that taught them survival. Forests, cities, beaches, and jungles became classrooms where lessons were paid for in blood. These soldiers learned quickly that victory depended on cooperation, discipline, and trust in the men beside them. Their experience also exposed the human limits of endurance. Prolonged combat left physical and psychological scars that did not fade with victory. Many veterans returned home changed in ways they could not easily explain. Silence became common. Society celebrated success, but often struggled to understand the cost paid by those who carried memories of violence, loss, and constant danger. Only later generations would begin to recognize the lasting impact of combat trauma. At the same time, the war demonstrated the strength of collective effort. American soldiers were supported by an entire nation mobilized behind them. Industry, science, logistics, and civilian labor played essential roles in sustaining the fight. The soldier at the front was never alone. Behind him stood factories, families, and communities contributing to a shared purpose. This unity became one of the defining characteristics of the American war effort. The legacy of World War II soldiers extends beyond the battlefield. Their return home reshaped the United States. Education expanded, home ownership increased, and economic growth accelerated. Veterans influenced politics, culture, and social values. The war generation carried with it a sense of responsibility forged under extreme circumstances. Their experiences shaped attitudes toward leadership, duty, and national service for decades. World War II also left a warning. The experiences of American soldiers revealed the cost of global conflict and the dangers of underestimating its consequences. They showed that war demands sacrifices that cannot be undone, even in victory. The destruction they witnessed and endured underscored the importance of preventing future conflicts whenever possible. Today, the American soldier of World War II is remembered not only as a figure of victory, but as a symbol of endurance under unimaginable pressure. Their story is not about glory, but about survival, responsibility, and the weight of decisions made in times of crisis. It reminds us that freedom and security are not abstract ideas, but outcomes shaped by real people facing real fear. As time passes and fewer veterans remain, the responsibility to remember grows stronger. Their experiences offer lessons about leadership, resilience, and the true cost of war. World War II shaped the modern world, but it was shaped first by the individuals who carried rifles, flew missions, sailed hostile seas, and endured combat far from home. The story of the American soldier in World War II is not just history. It is a reminder of what ordinary people are capable of when history demands extraordinary sacrifice. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.